Any war has its heroes, and as a rule, each national liberation movement always has its own symbols. A symbol of resistance to invaders, a symbol of victory and freedom. Moreover, there is an interesting pattern. Often it is women and girls who become such symbols. The heroine of the French resistance, Simone Sigan, the fearless girls of the Norwegian resistance, the fighters with the invaders in Holland and Yugoslavia are widely known. In the Soviet Union, for example, Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya, an intelligent officer, became one of the symbols of the resistance. After brutal torture, she was hanged by the occupants. The symbol of resistance in China became Chen Benhua. Her last photo, taken a few minutes before the terrible execution, is called by many as Chinese Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya or Chinese Mona Lisa. Before becoming that very symbol of China resistance, Chen Benhua was just one of the hundreds of thousands of ordinary girls. She was born in 1914 in the eastern Chinese village of Zhaoshang, Anhui Province. And the girl's life was also no different from the lives of hundreds of thousands of Chinese girls. However, an event in her life occurred, which became a turning point in history. Before the Second World War began, the equally fierce and bloody Sino-Japanese War broke out on the Asian continent. It began in the summer of 1937 and lasted 8 years. In history, it is considered part of the Second World War. Japan, having occupied China, aimed at domination, both political and military, the capture of areas rich in raw materials, as well as the complete subjugation and enslavement of the local population. Up until 1941, China resisted Japanese aggression with the help of the United States. In the beginning, both the Chinese government and Chinese nationalists actually offered mostly passive resistance to Japan, setting up guerrilla units and small subversive and propaganda groups in the invaded territories. However, the consequences of the occupation quickly led to an unprecedented growth of the national liberation resistance movement. The fact is that having landed in China, the Kwantung Army of Japan began perhaps one of the most bloody and merciless marches through the Chinese provinces. Already after the liberation of the world community, more than enough documents were presented confirming the atrocities that the Japanese troops committed on Chinese soil. Numerous experiments with chemical and bacteriological weapons conducted by the Japanese military on local civilians are also widely known. All these, and unprecedented atrocities and inhumane experiments perpetrated by the Japanese invaders on Chinese soil, led to the fact that at first passive resistance turned into a fierce and bloody war, which, in its essence, became a war for China to survive and preserve its own nation. Poorly armed and disorganized residents rose up to fight the invaders. Partisan units were formed everywhere, in which not only men but also women, old people, and even children fought. Chen Benhua, like many others, joined the partisan detachment. Unfortunately, there is no reliable information about the operations carried out by this squad. This unit itself was completely destroyed by the Japanese, so there are only sketchy data and just rumors. According to one information, the girl was an ordinary fighter of a partisan troop. According to another, a commander. Some sources indicate that Chen Benhua was a liaison between several partisan detachments and at the same time an agitator. Be that as it may, in 1938, when Chen Benhua was 24 years old, the partisans were ambushed during one of the operations. For the Chinese guerrillas, being captured meant only one thing: a long and painful death. The Japanese soldiers believed that it didn't even make sense to waste bullets on partisans. So the prisoners were stabbed to death with bayonets and beaten to death, buried alive, cut into pieces or burned. What kind of death awaited a prisoner depended only on the degree of savagery of the Japanese soldier and their imagination. At the same time, even before the execution, a prisoner was expected to undergo long, painful, and inhumane torture. Therefore, the captured partisans, together with Chen Benhua, may have gone through several circles of hell. Chen Benhua, as a girl, and the only one who was captured, besides everything, was brutally raped. And this was only the first and, no matter how cynical it sounds, the easiest stage of long and painful abuse and torture. Despite what was done to prisoners, as far as it known, they did not tell the Japanese any information, so everyone was brutally executed. The last survivor was Chen Benhua. Trying to break her stamina and force her to give the necessary information, the Japanese forced the girl to watch the execution of her comrades. Photographs and documentary evidence that survived until the end of war make it possible to understand what Chen Benhua saw in the last hours of her life. Some prisoners had their arms and legs cut off, and then their heads. Some were burned on a slow fire, some were buried alive, and some were stabbed to death with bayonets. However, even seeing all that and despite promises of an easy death, Chen Benhua did not say a word. And so, when the turn to the girl came, the Japanese photographer asked the executioner to postpone the execution for a few minutes for a historical, as it became later, photo. Chen Benhua was untied and allowed to stand and stretch in front of the camera for a few minutes. If you look at the picture itself, it seems that there is absolutely nothing terrible and creepy. In the foreground is a young girl. She openly and sincerely smiles, directly into the camera. Chen Benhua's hands are folded across her chest, and in general it seems that everyone in the photo is happy and enjoying life. There are 4 Japanese soldiers behind the girl. They also smile broadly, and one wearing glasses even laughs. Some sources say that there is a firing squad behind the girl. However, in fact it is not. It has already been mentioned that the Japanese almost never shot captured partisans, considering the bullet too mild a way of execution. Therefore, Chen Benhua, who had already survived torture and who had seen the execution of her comrades in arms, was well aware that in just a few minutes she would face a very long and painful death. However, there is not a drop of fear on Chen Benhua's face. On the contrary, she smiles openly, brightly, and sincerely as if photo was taken during the most ordinary moment. In one of the articles on the history of this photography, it is said, Chen even got her hands untied. Not a bit afraid of the danger, Chen Benhua stretched out her numb hands, ran her fingers through her disheveled hair, and turned her face towards the sun. She crossed her arms over her chest, smiled contemptuously, and looked resolutely into the face of death. At that moment, the Japanese war correspondent took the photo. After the photographer signaled that everything was over, the soldiers who were behind the girl got down to business. Chen Benhua was dying from bayonets and beatings. According to surviving testimonies, these happy Japanese soldiers did not even want to simply and quickly stab the partisan with bayonets. For at least a few of the longest minutes of her life, Chen Benhua experienced inhuman agony, dying from blood loss. What she felt at that moment no one will ever know, just as we will not know what her executioners felt and thought. However, the only picture preserved in the history is a Chinese girl boldly and without fear looking at the camera in the last minutes of her life. After the liberation of China in 1945, this picture almost instantly became a symbol of the resistance the Chinese people put up against the Japanese occupation. Chen Benhua became a national hero in China and one of the most revered heroines. A monument has been erected in her native village to which people from all over the country come to lay flowers. The sculpture made a full-length monument to the girl, exactly recreating that very famous photo.